Hi, I'm Buckley Brinkman with the Wisconsin Center for Manufacturing and Productivity. We've been helping small and medium manufacturers stay competitive for the last 30 years and really help them understand technology that's coming their way and how they can make the best use of that. One of the tools that we provide is the Wisconsin Manufacturing Report, where we get data on what manufacturers are thinking and what they're facing every single year. And this year's report had a really startling statistic in it. It was that 51% of Wisconsin manufacturers failed to see how artificial intelligence had anything to do with them. So rather than let this myth persist, we decided to produce these two videos that, number one, would help manufacturers understand the basics of AI, and then second, be able to see actual real world examples of how their peers are putting this technology to use this very day. So through these two videos, you'll get the basic knowledge and some of the examples you'll need to actually put this technology to use in your own facility. Now, to start this journey off, we're calling on our friends Enno Simpson and Danny Bauer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Business to start us off.
Hello, everyone. My name is Enno Simpson, and I'm here together with my colleague Danny Bauer, and we're both faculty at the Wisconsin School of Business here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. First, Danny will give you an introduction into artificial intelligence, what are large language models and how do they work, and then I will take over and give you a more practical hands-on demonstration in terms of what this means for your business. So, Danny, take it away.
Before we get started, we want to do some helpful disclaimers. Disclaimers number one is that a lot of the material that we're presenting today is taken from prior presentations, but also from conversations and other material that we're co-teaching with many of our colleagues at the Wisconsin School of Business. In particular, Enno and I are both instructors in our graduate programs, our Masters of Business Analytics, as well as our Masters of Data Insights and Analytics, which is an online master's degree. And we're teaching some of the material that we're going to talk about today, of course, in a lot more detail. The second disclaimer we want to start with is that AI is complex and quickly evolving, right? Arguably, what we're going to share with you today is going to be dated in a few months or even years from now. We're going to try to provide you some background that we believe is going to stand the test of time, but we're also going to show you some use cases, and those are going to change as we go on forward. But we hope that we're providing you with some overview of what we perceive as the cutting edge. Secondly, there's a lot of tools out there, and more are becoming available every day. We're going to we're going to rely on what we perceive as pretty mainstream tools, in particular ChatGPT. And we're going to assume that some of you have experimented with that, and even though there's a plethora of other tools. We're primarily relying on two references. One of them is Stephen Wolfram's What is ChatGPT Doing and Why Does It Work? It's a fascinating book. For those of you, are a little nerdy and want to dive into that more deeply, we highly encourage that as a read. But we're also going to talk a little bit about applications of ChatGPT. And if you're interested in devising more advanced prompts, there's this nice resource that we're providing on the bottom of the page here. In this first part, I'm going to try to provide you some idea of how AI works and how generative AI builds on AI. It's kind of unclear whether this makes you a better user of AI, right? So knowing how the nuts and bolts work doesn't necessarily give you better insight on how to engineer prompts or how to use ChatGPT. But we believe it provides some information on the limitations, right? And also some of the pitfalls in using these tools. Furthermore, we're going to try to provide some guidance, and Enno's going to do that part, on the effective use of large language models. So we're going to provide some general tips on prompt engineering, as well as show you some recent applications by showing you how to put together what is called a MyGPT in the context of a particular use case. So let me provide some AI background. How does it work and where is it going? When I talk about this, I typically like to start at what is generally deemed as the foundations of AI. And back in the 1950s, in the middle of the 20th century, a bunch of researchers, computer scientists, neuroscientists, and so on, got together in what is now called the Dartmouth workshops, and they coined the term artificial intelligence, right? So I'm telling you that for two reasons. Number one, I want to enhance your trivial pursuit skills, right? But secondly, back then there was like a big hype around AI. And in fact, one of the leading computer scientists of the day, Marvin Minsky, in 1970 said that he expects in that from 3 to 8 years, we will have a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being. Now, I don't know if you were around in the late 70s. That's when I was born. But we didn't have that, right? We didn't have a machine of the general intelligence of a human being and take it away and hide it for future generations. That just didn't happen, right? And the reason I like to mention this is that Marvin Minsky, who's the leading computer scientist of the day, was utterly wrong in his predictions. And I think that should humble us when we're trying to predict what's going to happen in 10 or 20 years from now. A second quote I really like to bring up in this context is a quote from Michael Jordan. Not the Michael Jordan of the Chicago Bulls, but the Michael Jordan from Berkeley University. Michael Jordan is a computer scientist who wrote this fascinating piece called AI, the Revolution is Yet to Come in 2019. So it's a few years old. And I'm going to read you a small part of his article. He writes, people are confused about the meaning of AI, that there's some kind of intelligent thought in computers competing with humans. We don't have that. Most of what's labeled AI today is actually machine learning, what means finding patterns in data and on making well-founded predictions. The reason I like this quote is that there's two parts of it. And I believe one of the parts of his quote has aged very well. To this day, most successful applications of artificial intelligence are actually machine learning. And machine learning is nothing else than predictive modeling. It's helpful to briefly talk about a somewhat more advanced application, namely that of self-driving cars. You see that gentleman on the right here is David Hasselhoff. Enno and I both spent our childhood in the 1980s in Germany. And if you grew up in the 1980s in Germany, you're required to have David Hasselhoff in every presentation you're giving. I'm joking, of course. But what about self-driving? So what about self-driving cars? You can sort of think two ways about self-driving cars. One way you can think about a self-driving car is feeding a computer with a bunch of information on how driving works. The rules of the street, right? The rules of traffic, the physics of a car, and so on. And you can try to instill logic into the car in order to figure out how to drive. Now, it turns out that that's not very successful, right? Self-driving cars are not trying to figure out the process of driving. Instead, what self-driving cars do is they try to match patterns of people that have driven. Imagine the following, right? If you want to come up with a self-driving car, what you ought to do is hire a bunch of 20-year-olds like after college, send them out, have them drive, and record the every move. You're going to have LiDARs and sensors on the car that are going to pick up the characteristics of the situation. That you can think about your X variable, right? That's the explanatory variable. And then you're going to pick up what they're doing as they're driving. Are they veering right? Are they veering left? Are they hitting the brake? Are they hitting the gas? The rest of it is just modeling, taking all this data of people driving, characteristics of the situation, and the actual driving moves. This is how self-driving cars work, and this is how a lot of modern AI works. It turns out that this is also what ChatGPT does. There are about 40,000 reasonably common words in the English language. And you can think about the internet as a gigantic training set. So there, you don't need to have people to go out and drive, but you can just rely on the internet as a gigantic text set. What GPT or ChatGPT is trying to do is looking at samples of text. For example, if the first words are the best thing about AI is its ability to, and it then scans the entirety of the internet in order to predict what is the likely next word. And based on the entirety of the internet, and this is actually from GPT, the most likely next word is learn. The second most likely Y is predict. The third most likely Y is make. This is actually coming from GPT. Now, if you feed it more words, you enlarge the predictive vector, you enlarge the X. So for example, if you include learn, you have as an input the best thing about AI, its ability to learn. And then the most likely next word, as is illustrated here on the right-hand side, is from. If you include from in the input, the most likely word that is going to come next is experience. The most likely word that's going to come next is it. By sequentially predicting, GPT or ChatGPT produces even lengthy prose, like very long text that feels like a human has written it. GPT-4, so the latest motor underlying ChatGPT, turns out to have about 1.76 trillion parameters. So it's much, much more complex, even though the way you put it together is fairly analogous. To illustrate how much more complex these models have become, I would like to show you an image from one of the most famous books on artificial intelligence. This is a book about deep learning written by some of the champions in that field. And it's going to take a second to explain this graph, but I think it's going to be worthwhile. What you see here on the x-axis, so from the left to the right, are years. It starts with 1950, and it goes here to the future to 2056, so about a century. And what you see on the y-axis is essentially an indicator of how large these predictive models are. You can sort of think about it as the number of parameters. So you can see here the dots, right, all represent predictive models that humans have built for different purposes. What you see on the right-hand side here, and that's kind of interesting, for example, like relatively simple organisms, such as roundworms or leeches or ants, have relatively few parameters in their brains, right? Whereas octopuses or frogs or humans have much more complex brains. Now, what's kind of like surprising, or maybe also a little daunting, is that the size of the predictive models that humans have been able to build, right? If you look at, like these predictive models number 19 or 18 or 20, right? They get much closer to replicating, right, the complexity of the brain of an ant, a bee, or maybe even a frog. But in recent years, and this book is a little dated, this is from 2015, this really has gone up. In fact, I added a dot here, namely GPT-4. As you can see, GPT-4 has almost as many parameters as our human brain does. Now, this is only one way of approximating the complexity of these models in a human brain, right? But this is sort of illustrating that right now these models start competing in their abilities with humans. So it's probably going to slope upwards, right? So we'll have to see how it's going to look in 2050 or even 2100 about how complex these models will get. So what this is all to say, and this is where I'm coming back to this original quote from Michael Jordan, right, is that these models are becoming much, much more complicated, even competing with the complexity that's going on in our brain, right? And so this is sort of like brought across really well by Stephen Wolfram in his book that I recommended earlier. And I'm gonna read that quote from his book. In effect, we're opening up the brain of ChatGPT and discovering that, yes, it's complicated in there, and we don't really understand what's going on, even though in the end, it's producing recognizable human language. Right? And so there, the question is, well, okay, Michael Jordan is right that what AI is nothing else than machine learning, and machine learning is nothing else than advanced predictive modeling. right? But does that mean that there is not intelligent thought going on in computers, right? If you ask ChatGPT what the meaning of life is, right? It doesn't give you a great answer, but it doesn't give you a worse answer than some people after 2 glasses of wine. I'm going to leave you with this and hand it over to Enno, who will talk a little bit about principles, pitfalls, and the potentials of these models.
Thank you, Danny. And hello, everyone. My name is Enno Siemsen. I am also a faculty member at the Wisconsin School of Business and very active in the field of forecasting and the applications of AI now to forecasting. So I'm going to take over and talk a little bit about some particularities of GPT and large language models. And then I'll go a little bit into use cases and things that you can test out right away. So Danny gave you, I think, a wonderful introduction into how a large language model works. And this book by Stephen Wolfram is very good about opening up this black box a little bit and trying to understand more how the model underneath it comes together. And something which is absolutely fascinating is, for example, this idea of randomness. And if you've played with ChatGPT a little bit, you know that every time you give it a prompt, it will give you something else in return. And it turns out that that is a feature, not really a bug. Because if you go back to the idea of a predictive model, you could figure out for every half sentence or so what is the most likely word and add the most likely word. And it turns out that if you do that, it's very boring. It doesn't really resemble human prose. And so what the engineers behind large language models figured out is that you actually have to reintroduce some randomness. So instead of always choosing the most likely words, what these models do is they just choose the most likely words more likely, but they can really choose any word that is sort of in the predictive set. They're just very unlikely to be chosen if they're really very unlikely to be the next word, right? So they use the probabilities to figure out the next word, but really draw random words. And that's why every time you prompt ChatGPT the same prompt, it will give you a different answer because underneath it is really a random model that picks words just by their likelihood. This is called temperature. And it's a setting in most large language models. You can set the temperature to 0, in which case it will always give you the most likely word, and you can set it to 2, in which case it will literally just spit out random things. So, you know, and most real settings are somewhere in between. And they can differ a little bit on application, right? So, for example, if you're want to create language around technical user manuals or maybe legal terms and so on, you want to set a very low temperature because you don't want the large language model to be very creative. But if you wanted to create haikus or similar things, you want to set the temperature higher to have a little bit more variation in there. And it's really quite fascinating. We don't fully know and understand why this has to be the case, but again, very low temperature models seem to create things that we as humans don't necessarily see as being very, very human prose, right? So there's an inherent randomness maybe to how we think about writing. And here's sort of some consequences, right? So first of all, large language models have become really, really good at providing long answers that feel like a natural conversation. And, we can use them now for a wide range of tasks, whether it's sort of providing you specific guidance about a topic or summarizing things. But again, always remember that the output is random. If you want to generate output and you don't like what you see, whether it's in a large language model or in another model like that is creating pictures, you can always use the same prompt again and see what else appears, right? The output is random. And it's also not replicable, right? To basically tell somebody, hey, try out this prompt and look at the answer isn't very meaningful because if they try out the prompt, they might get a different answer. Large language models can also forget. So if you have a very long conversation with a large language model, it does keep a certain memory and uses the history of your conversation to predict the next word, but eventually it starts forgetting some of these things because it has to. There's a certain limitation with respect to how many words it can keep in its memory. And so sometimes you have to bring up these words again, so that the model can remember it. And maybe most importantly, and this is an important pitfall, right? You should by now understand that all that ChatGPT does is it predicts the next word. It's essentially a fancy version of autocomplete. Now that's a little bit, reductionist, but that's what it does. It has no fact checking. It has no, it doesn't go back and take its output and run it by Wikipedia to see whether it is correct or anything like that. There's no safety in there that really ensures that the output is correct. And so it can hallucinate. Again, by sheer randomness also, sometimes it can pick a very unlikely word and go down an unexpected path. One key thing in interacting with a large language model is what is called prompt engineering, or understanding how to create a good prompt. And those of you who are around when Google became popular might remember that initially it took us a while to figure out how to interact with Google to get the search results that we needed. And ChatGPT is no different. It will all take us a while to really understand and figure out how to best interact with the large language model to create meaningful output. And so there's a lot of work out there where people are looking at what kind of prompts, how should you develop your prompts in order to get better results. And so, for example, here a good tip is this persona pattern, right? So tell ChatGPT, tell the large language model what role it should play, right? Should it be a customer? Should it be a medical doctor, etc.? And that gives us enough context in order to, in some sense, better predict what a good response sentence should be. So how is this useful to you? Some things you can do right away is, I know several executives who, for example, they say, well, I spend, I would usually spend at least a day a month writing job postings. I can reduce that now to half an hour because I have ChatGPT prepare the posting, and then I just read it over and make a few tweaks and off it goes, right? So some tasks like this, which are, very well defined, you can use it right away, and it will be sort of a personal efficiency tool, right? You can also use it to summarize, meeting notes and things like that, right? If you have a long meeting that is transcribed, you can feed that to ChatGPT, and it will summarize it for you. And that will allow you to basically store and retrieve sort of things that are discussed in meetings in a much easier way, right? So those are kind of things you can do right away. And I'll show you this in a second, but GPT has become a lot more customizable. You can adjust it to your specific context and feed it information that is specific to your company, right? And so let's say you are a small business owner, you maybe have 5 employees, and you don't have your own HR department, right? Everything which is HR, everybody who has an HR question comes to you, and it drains away your time. Well, I'm sure you have HR manuals. You can feed these HR manuals now to a large language model, and basically with a few, relatively easily create an HR-related GPT that will interact with your employees and probably take a lot of that work off your plate, right? And or how about interactions with your customers and suppliers, right? So there's probably a lot of standard questions, the standard ways that either customers and suppliers want to interact with you. And again, you have a lot of technical documentation that you can feed into a customized GPT that will make this exercise a lot more efficient for you. I would encourage you to experiment with this, and I'm going to show you an example about this in just 1 second. In order to do the things I'm going to do here, you need a subscription to OpenAI, which will give you access to the most recent version of ChatGPT, which is ChatGPT 4, as well as to the My GPTs or the custom GPTs. And in order to go to the custom GPTs, you can click on this button here that says Explore GPTs. And you can see a sort of interface opens over here where you can get an overview of other GPTs that people have created. But you can also click on this button to create your own GPT. And this is really very powerful. So I've done this for a company out here in Green Bay called Ducks Back. They are a manufacturer of essentially deck and siding material. So I created a custom GPT for them called Deck Builder, which again is just all I did is I downloaded the website from the company and I fed this website to the custom GPT. And what it essentially does is it, takes the information from the website as well as the style of the language that the company uses on their website and creates a customized version of ChatGPT for them. So I can ask the deck builder now and say, hello, I am thinking about building a deck. Can you recommend a product for me? Right? So I'm pretending to be a customer looking at their website, and we can take a look how ChatGPT thinks about this, right? So now not only does ChatGPT access all the data it's trained from the internet, but it also has specific data from the company, and it will immediately go into, and I've set it up to be essentially sort of a customer service representative. So we'll talk about the different abilities of the product and of the different kinds of product that the company has available, right? And so you can see, again, this is a very customized version of a GPT, and just one way of how you could think about deploying this on a website to interact with customers, or giving some of your customers an immediate way of or a different way of exploring your product portfolio. This could be very, very useful. So I hope you enjoyed this little demo, and I hope we've given you food for thought. I also hope we've inspired you to experiment with this technology and find the use cases that will work for you, whether it is things that relate to customer interactions or things that relate to marketing, creating, advertising content for you, maybe streamlining some of the processes in your back offices like HR. There are many applications that might work for you, and I hope you will use this as an opportunity to explore.
So Danny, that was great. I mean, I've heard the presentation before, and I always learn something new every time I see it. And that chat bot on the website is phenomenal. And just playing with it, it seems like it's ready to go. But I know it's not. If I'm creating something like that at home for my website, what do I have to be aware of before I actually flip the switch and put it live to my customers?
So that is a good question and a very important one. The first thing is, so currently, at least with OpenAI and ChatGPT, these MyGPTs still require a subscription for everybody using it, and not all of your customers might have a subscription to OpenAI. So I would first roll this out in just a smaller context to test it out, and particularly test it for hallucinations, right? If it's a chatbot related to your product, you want to make sure that you've asked it 1,000 times to talk about your products, and every time it gives you something that you actually sell and not a product that it made up. So test it extensively, keep it with a small audience. I'm sure throughout the year, we're going to see these custom MyGPT services open up to a wider audience, right? I think OpenAI is keeping them, behind the wall for now, but there are plenty of other companies out there that will create this capability for you. So right now, I would think about this more as prototype testing, get up to speed, see what you can do, keep a watch out for all the products that will be released there. And then, the other thing, of course, is be sure that you only feed it documents that are really publicly available, right? And whatever you upload into a custom GPT is going to end up with OpenAI and might be used in the training of other AI models soon. So you have to be careful that if you have really confidential data, that's probably not something you should feed into a MyGPT like this.
Yeah.
Danny, anything to add?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points I would emphasize, and I touched on those, but I think it's important to. So general guidance from people who work on this, also from OpenAI, is that you should provide a disclaimer that that people should take this information with a grain of salt, right? Secondly, they advise to use these only in situations where it's not completely problematic, right? If they're wrong, if they hallucinate. There's this famous story by an attorney that used ChatGPT to write its briefs, and it made up some cases that didn't really exist. And that attorney got into a lot of trouble doing that, right? You want to avoid this, right? You want to let the users know that this can happen potentially. And secondly, you only want to use it in contexts where veracity is not an absolute must.
So with all of this technology, I mean, it's obviously going to affect our jobs. I mean, where do you see where with your perspective and experience that you have out in the real world, do you see this having the biggest impact with particular jobs? And what can I do to make sure that that I'm one of the people who's benefiting from it and not being victimized by it?
All right, I'm sure we both have things to say about this because this is one of the biggest questions, right? And I mean, so this uses as a disclaimer in a sense that, right, there's many possible answers. Anna and I are not no better at predicting the future than other people, right? So it's a question about the future, and we don't really know where it's going. But I think there's a couple of principles, right? Number one, right now what we're seeing is that a lot of the back office jobs, right? So the jobs that were primarily on computers are the ones that are, probably more at danger as being taken over by AI, right? Because all the information is electronic already, right? And the output frequently is electronic too, right? So I think it's going to have a big impact on a lot of industries where there's no physical product, right? Where the products are also like in the ether, right? And where a lot of the jobs are done in the ether. My own sense is that physical robotics is lagging behind, right? So I mean, so for example, there was this, and probably a lot of people have heard about this, so like Tesla's demo not too long about the humanoid robot that wasn't all that impressive, right? So I think that's still so like I think further in the future. So I think like virtual jobs relative, like our jobs that don't have a physical product. I think manufacturing where there is a physical product is a little less dangerous. At least that's my sense. And the second thing that would emphasize is that, like, I mean, so there's going to be a shift going on, right? A lot of the, there, I like this quote. It's by one of my friends, Jim Gucha, who has this quote that, the hard things are easy for AI, and the easy things are hard for AI, right? So a lot of the things that are difficult for us, right? Summarizing a large amount of text and so on, right? I think that's where ChatGPT is really going to come into play. But a lot of the things where you have to think strategically, where you have to weigh different options, right? Where you have to make judgment, right? That's where AI, at least at this point, doesn't excel. And I think, like if you're in a job where you can sort of emphasize the pieces of your job that are more judgment, that are more sort of strategic, that are weighing objectives, that are thinking, that are discerning different competing alternatives, I think those are the jobs that I don't see being necessarily taken over by AI anytime soon. Anything to add?
If you play with ChatGPT, ask it to create images for you, create radio ads for you. It will do all of these things, and it does a pretty fabulous job, right? So if you don't want to employ somebody to, create content on Instagram or wherever for you, there's plenty of AI solutions now that can really do that for you. So, but I think also if I am Procter and Gamble, I'm still going to employ a couple of really creative people, right? So I think it increases the bar in these professions, because the top 20% of people in those professions are still going to have a job, because they're just going to be so much better than what ChatGPT does. So again, I think it raises the bar for competition. We have to be, in certain jobs, we just have to be better. There's no way that you can be mediocre at it, because that's fairly easy to beat with automation. But yeah, I mean, we're going to see real shifts, but humanity has faced these shifts before. We have always been like, this is going to be doom, who's going to be employed. We've always found ways to find employment for people. And I am an optimist. I believe that will continue. But again, it will mean reskilling. Some people that have been employed in a particular area for 10, 15 years might have to find different areas of work. And I think, generally raises the bar for human skills. You have to be really good at what you do.
So as this has all been really great, so as we close here, from each of you, what is one thing that you want the people watching this to hold on to and take away from this hour?
Engage and experiment.
That's what I would have said too. And it was faster. He beat me to the punch. But I think, yeah, so like not being left behind, right? The second piece, I mentioned that earlier, is, like, think very carefully about sort of like what, there's a lot of things that humans can do. Like, as again, I'm gonna, like, a lot of times this runs under the tagline judgment, right? So as you build yourself out, as you sort of like move upward in your career, right? So especially if you have a job that is, as Enno indicated, in one of these areas where potentially ChatGPTs or other AI tools are going to have an impact, emphasize the pieces of your role that require judgment, that require strategic thinking, because I think that's where humans still add a ton of value.
Right. So much of business is built around, creating relationships and the trust that creates, etc. ChatGPT doesn't build relationships, right? It does help you convey information, and it does help you maybe automate things, but ultimately, the power of business is still based on human networks and the relationships it creates. We have to ask ourselves as educators, right? What does this mean for us? And certainly, I think the way we convey information in the classroom is going to change quite a bit. The way we assess students has already had to change, because so many students can now use ChatGPT to create answers, right? But in the end, what we do in the classroom is we create networks and relationships, and people learn from each other, etc. That part is not going to go away, right? The strength of human connections is gonna remain a powerful aspect of business and education.
Well, guys, this has been great. Thank you for some really good information. You've given us a lot of things to think about, and I really appreciate your time. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.